my dear father. My dear father is my number one listener. He is the first to listen every week. If you are listening, this is not the episode for you. I love you. I appreciate you. Not the episode for you. Hello, and welcome to the She Got Lucky podcast. If you are new here, hi. If you're a regular listener, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I've got a real treat for you today. I've actually invited my past sex and sensuality coach to come and speak to you on some really key topics that, as females, I think we need to talk about. So if you haven't heard, seen, or come across Eleanor, let me properly introduce her. Eleanor Hadley is a certified sex educator, speaker, and writer based on the Gold Coast, Australia. As an award-winning sex and relationship coach, she shares entertaining and practical sex education through a variety of courses, including the wildly popular Tongue Tactics, where she teaches tangible tips and tricks for going down. Renowned for her embodied lap dance teachings, Eleanor has taught the art of seduction on national stages, including FemCon and Sexpo. She's a content creator and counts large brands such as Adore Beauty, Love Honey, and Frenchie as her clients. As a regular featured writer for various national publications such as Who, Women's Health, and Vice, she is known for her signature, informative, yet cheeky and relatable style. Eleanor also hosts popular award-winning podcasts, Sex, etc., where she shares tangible tips on how to prioritize your pleasure, enhance your sex life, and elevate your relationships. I have had the absolute privilege and pleasure of working with Eleanor, and it really has been so much more than I ever thought it would be. As I mentioned, this episode was an absolute non-negotiable, and look, if you like this episode as much as I think you're going to like it, please be sure to leave a review. Let me know, because I've mentioned to Eleanor in this episode, I think we're going to need a follow-up one. So if you've got questions, if things pop up whilst you're listening, note them down in your mind, on your notes in your phone, and send them on through, because I'm definitely thinking we're going to need a follow-up. Anyway, enough from me. Let's dive into this episode. Let's go. So, Eleanor, I love to start off my guest episodes by inviting them to share their own She Got Lucky story. You are wildly killing it. You are working with major brands. You are on major podcasts. You are really seen as one of the industry leaders. For a lot of people watching, it could be easy to think, oh, well, she got lucky because of this. She got lucky because of that. You've really quite seamlessly and beautifully just become such a natural leader in this space. Have you had a moment, or have you had someone break that success down to luck?
This was such an interesting question to kind of consider, because I think that just even generally as a business owner, because the lifestyle that I lead is very flexible, very open. I'm not like a 9-to-5 girly. Like, I barely ever worked in corporate. I've always owned my own businesses, really. And especially with this current business, I work when I want to work and when I am inspired, and I live up in Queensland. I am a sun worshipper. I go to the beach during the day. I really kind of have incredibly intentionally designed my life so that I can prioritize pleasure, which we're going to talk about a lot throughout this episode. And a lot of the time people say, wow, like, you're so lucky that you get to go to the beach in the middle of a work day. And yeah, sure. But this was intentional, this is by design. I decided that I wanted to create a life that really filled me up, and I didn't want to spend every single second working. It's still in the back of my mind a lot, and that doesn't completely turn off, but it was an intentional decision to create it like this.
Yeah. And I think that this really leads so beautifully into the conversation we're going to have today, because everyone has that choice, regardless of, you may not live on the beautiful Gold Coast, you may not live in this beautiful beach place, or you might have other circumstances, but you have the option to bring in more pleasure, more joy into your days, into what your business looks like. And I just I love this so much, Eleanor, and I'm excited to dive in. So I think let's start with, rather than me asking you, tell me about your story, tell me about how you got here, I want to know what led you to becoming, a sex educator? What led you to helping more women, more men find the pleasure and joy in life?
That's a great question. And a lot of my journey did start in my previous business. So this is the second business that I've owned. The previous one was a pole dancing studio down in Melbourne that I had for 4 years. And that was a big catalyst for me to create a business that was even more me. That one was a part of a franchise. So I only had so much creative control. And a really key part of the journey to becoming a sex educator, I didn't actually think one day I'm going to become a sex educator. That's what I'm going to set out to do. I just sort of followed little breadcrumbs and things just kind of opened up to me. And it was this moment after I'd gone through a really, really rough breakup where I was kind of using dance as my form of therapy. And I was, after class, really just using the movement to kind of heal what I was going through. And I was doing that after I was teaching classes, and I would stay back behind at the studio and just flow and let myself move. And I realized how powerful it was to not have choreography to follow, because that's everything that we did at the studio was always choreography. And I was like, I just want to move and feel. And that inspired me to create my own movement practice, which I then created after I sold the studio. And then that inspired me to talk more and more about sensuality in a public sort of manner. And then it just kind of expanded. And I was like, you know what? Being connected to your senses, being connected to your sensuality is different to being connected to your sexuality, but they play together so well. Yes. And so it just sort of started to expand. And I was like, I actually want to talk more about sex, and I'm interested in talking about the taboo. And I think it's really powerful, and pleasure is so healing. And so it just kind of kept expanding for me. And it's such fulfilling work to be able to speak to topics that a lot of people kind of bristle at or will sort of shy away from.
I think that you've really hit it on the head of the embodied dance.
Yeah, it started with sensual movement, and then it moved into the art of seduction, which is embodied lap dance. Yeah.
The really beautiful thing here that I've just seen is the way you've talked about dancing. And a lot of us, when we think about dancing, we need to have all the moves figured out. We need to make sure that we don't look silly. We need to make sure this idea of choreography, do this, step this. I feel like this right here is such a beautiful sort of outline of what you do, really, because we as women, we've stepped into this mode of being productive, getting things done, moving from one thing to the other, tick, tick, tick. This is how I do my routine. Your routine is like this dance that you've learnt. And I really love it because you're like, I know this sounds wild, but we are going to throw that routine out the window for a moment, and we are going to allow you to play in this art of sensual movement, of sensual dance. And I think that's really incredible, just thinking about that, thinking about the way we move our lives like routine. And yes, it feels good to have routine, but what do you see, Eleanor, with a lot of your clients? And for anyone listening, I worked with Eleanor and I just freaking adore this woman so much. She is so good at what she does. And when I first came to her, I straight away learned the difference between sex and sexuality and sensuality. This was such a big lesson for me because we were working together on my pleasure. And what a lot of people will think instantly is, oh, okay, all right. What were you two talking about? What were you, what did you? And it wasn't necessarily like that. That was a component, sure, but bringing more pleasure into your life is about all the little decisions you decide and make each day and the ways that you could enjoy something more, but it might be quicker, or it might be more efficient to take this other route. So what do you find a lot of, particularly the women that you work with, Eleanor, they come and by being in such structured routine, got to get things done, not really allowing for that time for pleasure, what is that restricting them from? What is that holding them back from?
Oh my goodness, it's holding them back from a lot. And also you almost made me cry there. Thank you. I loved working with you. I think that, if you're so rigid and so particular in this idea that I have to get XYZ done and it has to be in this perfect manner and so much control, like even just talking about it, my shoulders are kind of clenching up, my hands are kind of clenching. It's like I've got to fit into this little box and everything must be done and it has to be scheduled one after another. And it's very rigid, it's very linear, and there's not a lot of like freedom for movement in there. And that's kind of like the physicality of it, but energetically, emotionally, like if we're not giving ourselves some sort of spaciousness, then we actually don't know how much space we can take up. Like often when I teach sensual movement in my dance classes, I'll tell people, take up space, do some like big body circles and like take up as much space as possible. Don't try and like stay on your yoga mat, this silly little rectangle. Like there was actually one little tangent. I used to, I had this idea to create round yoga mats, like really big 1 meter round yoga mats. It was like, I literally was like searching for suppliers. I didn't end up doing it, but I was like, I hate this little rectangle. I don't want to be in this. I want to be able to like move around and roll around and flow. And so, with our schedules, and especially as business owners, there's so much to do. There's so many things that we need to do. And we can also create a lot of work for ourselves. We go, oh, I should add this and this and this and this and this. And we're always thinking of more ideas. But if we allow a little bit more spaciousness, a little bit more creativity, a little bit more flow, and especially pleasure, for me, pleasure is everything. Of course, too much pleasure can lead to pain. But what is missing sometimes, I think, in everyone's life is this depth of pleasure. We're not fully enjoying it, or we're waiting to reach a certain goal before we allow ourselves to celebrate or feel into it. But we never actually do that. We think, oh yeah, when I get XYZ or when I hit this mark, then I'll celebrate. But you don't ever do it. And so for me, and something that we worked with together was infusing pleasure into the everyday, not waiting for a moment and that's when I'll feel pleasure. And especially when it comes to sex, like, I'll only feel sexual pleasure in that moment. There's other moments where you can experience different types of pleasure: simple pleasure, sensual pleasure, sexual pleasure. And they're all so different, and I think when we start to open our eyes to the ways that we can feel pleasure, we start to feel more, and that builds and builds and builds our capacity to hold even more, like this depth of pleasure,
I love this. I love this so much. So can we dive into those 3 types that you just mentioned there? So simple, sensual,
and sexual.
Cool.
Sexual.
So can we dive into the 3 different pleasures that you work with? Because I think this is really beautiful to sort of set up this conversation. And it really is like one of the things that I've spoken to, because you know me, I am someone who will literally, like when I find someone who is great, I will scream your name from every rooftop that I can scream it from. So anytime I'm like, oh my gosh, you need Eleanor. Oh my gosh, you need Eleanor. Yes, I know you might think sex educator, but she's so much more than just that. Like, yes, she has great tongue tactics. Yes, she can give you lots of sneaky little tricks, but so much more than that. And this is the thing, is the conversation about what pleasure means for women needs to be spoken about. So let's dive on into the 3 types of pleasure that you just sort of mentioned there.
Beautiful. So simple pleasure is the first, most easily accessible pleasure. And the thing is with pleasure, and especially talking about pleasure from the perspective of a sex educator, I think the assumption is that I'm always talking about sex, right? And then it's like, oh yeah, self-pleasure, exploring any type of pleasure must mean that you're getting it on and you're just having sex all the time. And sure, great. If that's your thing, go for it. But simple pleasures are those everyday, tiny little things that feel good. Pleasure is about, this feels good. Right. And so something that I can even speak to right now is I've got some tea in front of me and I've just been holding onto this tea this whole conversation because it feels really nice. It's comforting, it's warm, it's cozy. And no, I'm not feeling like turned on by it, but it's pleasurable, right? There's a difference. And so simple pleasures, there could be so many things. I talk about like even like when you're washing your hands under the nice warm water. I think like warmth is a theme for me today. When even like going out into the sunshine, like the pleasure of sun on your face, like, oh my gosh, how beautiful to have that moment. I remember in high school, I grew up in Melbourne, and so it's cold as all hell down there most of the time. And I remember
I know.
in high school, I went to this like bush kind of school, and we'd have to walk between classrooms outside, and it was always freezing. And that moment of winter sun, Alicia, and you just stop and you're just like, thank God, that is so nice. That is so beautiful, and that's a simple pleasure. So then we've got more sensual pleasure, which I would sort of categorize sensual as more of the body. So to me, sensual means of the senses. And we spoke about this a lot when we were together as well. This idea that like to be sensual is to be of the senses. I'm aware of and connected to the senses. And so often when I talk about sensuality, I'll use the estimation of mindfulness. Most people are quite familiar with mindfulness, and you have that typical kind of grounding exercise of name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can taste, blah blah blah. And that's just this awareness of your senses, and that's great. But sensuality is like this connection to and this savoring, finding pleasure in the senses. So what can I feel right now? I actually have this like little, I'm like surrounded by pleasure and sensual things. I've got this tablecloth on my desk right now that's like velvet, and so that feels really, really nice. And maybe you have like a candle going and that smells really nice, and maybe you have some like a Loco Love chocolate. Have you ever had those? God, they are delicious.
Oh yes, I have.
You have one of those and it tastes good. So using your senses, not just noticing like, oh yeah, this tea it tastes nice, but being like, oh my gosh, this is so pleasurable to drink, and I'm really enjoying it, and I'm savoring these senses. So again, it's not necessarily about sexual pleasure or gratification. It's just that connection to your sensuality, to your senses. Then, of course, the one that most people would be kind of familiar with when I say the word pleasure is sexual pleasure. And that's that idea of that practice of cultivating sexual energy and sort of moving that through your body, all the way through your body, and feeling that connection either with yourself or with a partner, solo or a partnered sex. Irrelevant which type of sex you're having, you can build that sexual energy and that sexual pleasure as well. So it's kind of like this big, beautiful spectrum, I think, when it comes to pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And because a big thing that I loved through our work is by allowing myself to be more open, aware, and bring in little bits of pleasure whenever I can, it really did, and especially as business owners, especially as entrepreneurs, creativity is such a power of ours. And by bringing in more pleasure, it not only helped creativity, but it also reduced the stress. It reduced that tightness, as you spoke, you said before, I'm feeling tight just thinking about all this structure and routine, and that has its place. We're not saying throw it out the window, but by allowing yourself to tap into this a little bit more, the creativity, like everyday women who I work with, like, oh, but I'm not creative. And it's like we've stepped into this sort of like robot mode where to be a perfect woman, like let's get rid of this idea of perfect straight away, but to be the successful woman, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that. If you're a mum as well, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that well. And like all these little things sort of put us into this rigid, robot-y like functioning mode. And so by bringing in this element that we're talking about of more pleasure, it allows you to reduce your stress and tap more into that creativity, which is such a superpower.
Yeah, it's so special, honestly. And, to get a little bit esoteric on you, our pleasure center is equal to our creative center. And so, yeah, the more pleasure that we do bring into our lives, the more creativity we'll bring into our lives. We'll be able to, ideate and bring these things to life because that energy is moving through us, that energy of pleasure. And so that spaciousness to allow yourself to have those moments. And yeah, it's not about saying, oh, I'm going to just throw out the calendar and the to-do list completely. It's like, okay, we can have a little bit of balance here. But sometimes what has happened, particularly in corporate mode, but also as an entrepreneur, we are trying to prove ourselves. We're trying to do a million things, wear a million hats, and we get rewarded. I think just in society in general, we get rewarded for being productive and for how much we produce and what we have done, right? And so I am honestly just like, I have a very, very fraught relationship with the word productivity and productive. And I think I used to, for years, most of my life, I really measured my self-worth with my productivity. You know how you go to like a yoga class and they'll sometimes say, set an intention, a sankalpa or something. And for years, mine was, I am productive. I am productive, because I had this idea that I wasn't, and I wasn't enough, and I wasn't worth much if I wasn't producing so much and I could show everybody, look how hard I've been working, look at all the things that I did today. And like, also I need like a little energetic tap on the head, a little gold star for that. And I got to a point where I was like so sick and bored of seeking that validation, and also like recognizing that I had this deep sort of internalized capitalism, right, that was holding me back and going, you're only worthwhile if you have made money, created something for other people. And that mindset, that like deep like sense of ingrained programming, that takes you a million miles away from pleasure, right? Because it sees my only purpose is to do. And when you're only doing, you're never just being. And we have this deep disconnection from our physical body. We have a deep disconnection from our pleasure. We're only living in our heads, and we kind of forget about everything else from the neck down. The amount of my clients that have come to me and they're like, yeah, I just live up here all day, but I don't know, like nothing feels good. I can't feel anything. They almost feel desensitized sometimes. They're like, yeah, if I touch here or there, like, it's okay. But they're not deeply feeling because they don't exist in their own body.
And as you were talking, I had all these things in my head. I'm like, oh, we got to talk about that. We're going to talk about that, right? But I think this is a really beautiful segue into this space of a lot of women I speak to just having this conversation openly. It really blows my mind at how many women have been like, I'm exactly the same. I understand this. Is this numbness, as you've just spoken about, we live up in our head. And because of that, there is, whether you have a partner or whether you're single and you're trying to connect with yourself, wherever you are. But for someone who starting my business in those first 2 years where I was just so go, 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 I was so against, like I felt like there was a clock. I felt like I had to get things done all the time. And one of the reasons I came to you, Eleanor, was because I felt such a numbness in my body. And I wanted to be present with my partner, but I couldn't because I felt like sex was a chore. And every time I sort of went to there, I was like, okay, let's tick it off. Let's be a good girlfriend. Let's get it done. And I was like, oh, but could I be more productive? My task-oriented brain sort of stepped in. And it's like, oh, is this moving the needle forward? Could I be getting more sleep? Could I be, getting something else done? And it was such a really heartbreaking, like slippery slope because, in the moment you're like, oh, I'm just prioritizing sleep. I'm just prioritizing this. I've had a hard day. I've had a busy day. No worries. But there's such a big disconnect, especially when you do have a partner, not only with yourself, but then them as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the clients you work with, what are they experiencing in this area? And perhaps how we can start to disconnect this idea of sex being like another thing and how we can start to actually enjoy it and less be like a chore anymore.
Yeah, gosh, I think that so many people will resonate so deeply with that, Alicia, because I can't tell you how many people have come to me with that experience of feeling like, yeah, like sex is fine, but I just I'm either not enjoying it, I'm not even thinking about it, I'm not prioritizing it, or I'm feeling incredibly guilty because I don't feel connected to myself or not at all to my partner. And sometimes there can be this resentment that kind of comes in when you feel like maybe your partner is expecting something and you don't feel like you have that to give, or you don't have a desire to. And this could go into a much bigger, more nuanced conversation about desire and the different ways in which we feel desire. And just because you don't out of the blue suddenly want to get it on with your partner every single night, or at the drop of a hat, that doesn't mean that you don't have a libido. It's just that we don't have, like, culturally, we don't have a full understanding of the scope of what desire means. We have different types, spontaneous and responsive, right? And that's a whole other conversation, fascinating one and very helpful one. But I think when we see sex as a chore and something I'm meant to tick off, some people will say, oh, well, how many times should we have sex to keep the relationship alive? And I find that to be such a funny question to reflect on, because it's like, well, why are you trying to tick this off? Like, why are you just trying to put that? Are you putting that in like a Notion template and adding it to your habit tracker?
Yes, it's not like an Instagram strategy where it's like, I have to post this many times per week.
Exactly. Like the idea of like, oh, that if I am doing this thing 3 times a week, then okay, cool, that means that we're fine. But like, let's think about the quality. Let's think about the connection. And so often what I say, if people aren't enjoying sex or desiring it, let's take it off the table and prioritize intimacy. Because the reason that we have sex, yes, it feels good, but predominantly the reason we have sex is to connect either with ourselves sexually or with our lover. And so if we aren't prioritizing any form of intimacy, then it's going to be really hard for us to actually want sex, particularly if you're someone who resonates with more of a responsive desire, where you desire sex only after something sexual or intimate is happening, right? And that's a lot of us. And so I would always say, how can you be more intimate with yourself or with your partner? How can you prioritize some kind of connection, some playfulness, some kind of bond, rather than going, oh, we just have to tick this off because having sex is a thing that is meant to be good for us. It's good for your immune system. It's good for sleep. It's good for skin, like whatever. Like, seeing this as something that we're like trying to find, what are the benefits? What are the key features of sex? What are the key benefits of sex? And how am I going to tick this off on my little habit tracker? Like, that goes against the entire purpose of why we're doing this. Like, let's connect. Let's feel pleasure, and let's try to feel pleasure in a different way. And I know that it can be incredibly hard to prioritize it, and I think that, I don't know if I've spoken to you about this in the past, but I've spoken to other people who are in like the coaching industry as a whole. And it's so interesting to me because I feel like people are quite willing, especially if you're an entrepreneur, way more willing to invest in working with someone or doing a program or buying a product that will then make some kind of ROI.
Yeah.
Are you going to get a return on investment on this particular thing? Then cool. Is it going to make me money? Is it going to save me time? Blah, blah, blah. And look, to invest in sexuality, whether that's money or time, it often, to a lot of people, because it's so taboo, it can feel really frivolous. It can be like, oh my God, like, why would you do that? Like, that's so not important. Like, here are my priorities and sex is down here. And it can almost feel too much to say, well, it actually is quite a high priority for me. Because we're not encouraged to, especially as women, but in society, we're not encouraged to recognize or admit, I'm a sexual being and I enjoy sex. But you know what? Your body is designed for pleasure, so it's a great thing. And if you want to prioritize it, if you want to have better sex, then go for it and let yourself as well.
Yeah, and I really love this because I think it really is a case of like, well, I prioritize my partner. Our relationship is important. So therefore, okay, this is a priority, because in order to have a good relationship on paper, what we see in movies, what we see in TV shows, I think back to like this absolutely like movie, right? Like, I think it was called Couples Retreat or something. And one of the guys comes along to his friends and he's like, we're only having sex once a week. Like, we're going to need to divorce. I was like, in my head, these little moments, these little things are ingrained because there isn't this conversation that is in the public forum, the public space about, I don't have sex every week. I don't feel like it. Like all these things. And so I feel like a big part of it is because we're so disconnected from our body. It's like, okay, well, I do love my partner.
Yeah.
And when I'm into it, I'll enjoy it. But like the actual process, that feels a bit tough to do and, you know, chore-like. So one of the really beautiful things that I loved working with you, Eleanor, is discovering these stories. Every female I feel, and men as well, but where it's called She Got Lucky. So the ladies, hello. So we, as we've grown up, have had our walls painted by what other people think. And when it comes to the world of pleasure, sex and sensuality, this is a big thing. And so uncovering where these stories come from, uncovering why we feel uncomfortable to talk about it or to do this or to be proud about it, whatever it might be, was a really incredible process. I remember going through this with you, Eleanor, in the sense of why I've always felt shame about being openly sensual, openly sexual, was because film student, watching films and things and the constructions of the characters was, I didn't like scary movies. I hated scary movies, but I had to watch them to learn about films and the way scary movies were constructed. And one of the big things in scary movies is the promiscuous female is always killed first. She is always killed first. The promiscuous one who's open about her sex and how much she likes it and everything like that, she is killed first. And so uncovering this story and realizing one of the reasons why I've always felt bad about talking about it, about, you know, being open about it, about enjoying self-pleasure and being okay with that, was because in my mind, I was always looking around the corner being like, I'm openly promiscuous right now or enjoying this. Where am I going to be killed off? Someone's going to come kill me now. And these little things, right? It might sound, if you don't resonate with this, that's absolutely okay. Quite a unique thing for me. But if you don't resonate with this, you might think, oh, that's ridiculous, right? But we all have these little stories, and that is what's sort of actually building this bigger story and this bigger pull back from enjoying and being present with sex and just being openly okay with, I'm a female and I get to enjoy this.
Oh my gosh, Alicia, when you had that realization in our sessions, it was like, I could tell that it was just this massive aha moment, and like things started to kind of like almost fizzle away and clear, you know? And it's so interesting because logically, it's not like your fear was like, oh, someone will actually come and kill me, like the Scream guy is going to come and get me for enjoying sex. But, you know, these little messages that we get in so many different ways. And almost every single person, I can guarantee every single person listening will have some version of that story. Mm. That one is yours, and there's probably some others in there too. But everybody has something, some kind of messaging that they've picked up on. And most often it's like, okay, if you enjoy sex, then you are bad, you are wrong, you are too much, you are slutty, blah, 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 and I'm going to be judged in some way. I'm going to be ostracized in some way, right? Our biggest fear is to be kind of pushed out of the community, right? And judged. And so what we do is we censor ourselves and we water ourselves down. Other people, maybe other people do it too, you know, like religious sort of organizations might do it, parents might do it, teachers might do it. They'll say things and be like, oh, don't be too much, you know, oh, that skirt is too short, blah, blah, blah. And then there's a lot of external, but there's also a lot of internal ways that we will repress ourselves. We will repress our own sexuality, and we'll go, there's a story that I've created in my head from X, Y, or Z interaction or something that I've seen. And now I'm going to protect myself, because that's all we're trying to do, is we're just trying to protect ourselves. And I'll create this program, I'll create this wall, and through that wall, I'm not going to access my pleasure, right? And so a big part of my work is figuring out that story, figuring out those walls and kind of bringing them down. Because, you know, you mentioned before Tongue Tactics is by far my most popular course, and it's all about tips and tricks, right? And most often people want the tips and tricks because it's fun, it's easy, it's accessible, right? And you can, use those till the cows come home. Amazing. You're going to have some great sex. But to really have the depth of pleasure that your body is available for, we need to actually start from within, right? And so, you'll remember from our work together, I didn't just jump in on call one and be like, okay, cool, so here's how you do it: up, down, left, right, side to side, whatever. Like, it's not about technique per se. It's about really allowing yourself to figure out what stories are holding me back and how can I remove those and work through them and integrate it so that I can give myself permission to even feel pleasure, right? Because people can be doing our partner could be like amazing, doing some amazing techniques, but if we're not allowing ourselves to receive that pleasure from them, then we're going to be like, oh yeah, they're no good at sex, or oh, I just don't like it very much. Well, your body probably has a deep capacity to enjoy and feel that depth of pleasure, but we might not be letting ourselves, because we can get in our heads so much and we will just shut it down. We cock block ourselves.
And especially because I've definitely spoken with you about this as well, Eleanor, in sense of the good girl, the idea of the good girl. And we're all going to have our own version of this. But growing up, you're taught to be a good girl. Oh, good girl for doing that, good girl for doing this, good girl for doing that. And so we start to build this understanding of what a good girl is and does and acts like. And so this was a big thing in the sense of, oh, well, a good girl doesn't openly do this, doesn't openly do like that. Even in my brand, it was a really big learning curve for me, because I was like, oh, well, a good girl, a good entrepreneur female wouldn't be, oh, that's, not professional and things like this. But this conversation about a good girl, I know that this is something you deal with a lot. And how do you help your clients start to break free from this?
Yeah, this is a really big topic. This idea of, the good girl, or like being seen as professional, or even this ties into what we call the Madonna whore paradigm. I feel like we may have gone through this when we worked together. It's this idea that women can be one of two archetypes. They can be either the Madonna, which is that virginal Mother Mary kind of idea, the mother kind of archetype, who weirdly, the idea is that, that mother figure is not at all remotely sexual, despite the fact that you have to have sex to become a mother. So it doesn't make sense, but it is this sort of virginal, pure kind of woman. That's the good girl. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got the whore. And so you can either be one or the other. And which is not true, but the assumption in society is that you can be either the Madonna, that mother, pure, sweet, good girl figure, or you're the whore, the person who likes sex, who is even, like, this doesn't even have to do with sex necessarily. It's like that confident person who owns her body, is comfortable in her skin, wears what she wants, and doesn't necessarily worry about other people. That is considered like, oh, that's a bit too much, a bit too wrong. We want the good girl. And so the Madonna whore dichotomy essentially is all about this idea that people will see you as one or the other, and you can't possibly be both. But we know you most definitely can. You can be a mother and a sexually liberated woman because you had sex to get there, to become a mother in the first place. But you can also, you don't have to sort of fall into this like sweet, like innocent mother archetype that society would have us sort of sit into, this sort of housewife vibe. And not that like there's anything wrong with being a housewife. I think there's actually a lot of power in that too. But it's more like we often will put ourselves in boxes. Society puts us in boxes. They say you can be this or you can be that. But really, we're incredibly multifaceted. We've got so many different sides to ourselves. We can be everything. We can be sexually liberated. We can enjoy sex. We can be incredible mothers. We can be like epic business owners. We can be so many things. And so it's like this permission piece of like, you can actually live your life in the way that you want. And yes, there might be people who are stuck in that paradigm of, no, there's two options. And if you stray from this one, that means you must be this one. And that's how I'm going to see you. But if we live our lives for the purpose of how other people are going to see us, Like we're never going to be deeply filled with pleasure. We're never going to be fully expressed. And I think that we all deserve to live life in a way that really fills us up and makes us feel really authentic. And whether that is, openly talking about how much you love sex, or if it's just wearing a certain, item of clothing that you wouldn't have usually worn because you're afraid of what other people will think. Like, it doesn't have to be this wild sort of, really daring thing suddenly. Like, you're seen as like this like sexpert, but it can just be, yeah, no, actually, this is something that I prioritize and it is important to me. And I have no shame in talking about it because it's a really natural thing,
Yeah.
We get to make that decision.
And I think that it's just so beautiful. And I'm thinking that I'm going to have to convince Eleanor to come back and do another episode at some point, because there's going to be like, we could literally have a whole episode on just answering questions, because I know that perhaps you've listened to this episode thinking, oh, awesome, like sex, sensuality, juicy, I like it. And you've perhaps come out, and this is what I'd really love, because this is sort of my experience with working with Eleanor. I came in being like, right, can you help me? I need this. I've experienced this. Help. And I went in being like, let's get the job done. I came out realizing how powerful this work is, in a sense, is we as women can break out of the box that perhaps others have created, but a lot of the time we have created for ourselves. We can be this and we can also be this. We can be sensitive, but we can also be strong and firm in our decisions. We can be a leader, but we can also be learning at the same time. So learning that we can be more than one thing, learning that we can be this dance, in a sense. Even the idea of when someone works with a coach, for example, coming to work with you, I was like, cool, this is what I want. This is what I want to walk away with. This is what I need. And it's like, but the experience and the process of learning that with you, it was like this really beautiful dance that allowed me to learn so much more about myself and the way I move and the way I do things. And that's what I wanted with this episode. So I'm very, very, very grateful for you, Eleanor, because I just think this work is so powerful. And regardless of why you did listen to this episode, I hope that you've had a bit of that experience, because this work is so strong. Eleanor is incredible. I'll put her details below. But Eleanor, one thing I'd really, really love to finish on, for somebody who is struggling with their libido, struggling with getting out of their head, because even I've learned that even when my partner and when I have time really off, oh my gosh, the level of connection, the intimacy that we're able to have, because we're not so up in our heads of all the things we need to be doing and all the things we need to blah, 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 blah. That is so powerful. So how can we start to connect with our bodies more so that we can bring in sensuality, we can bring in sexuality and not feel guilty for it?
This is so beautiful. And yeah, let's not think of this as like a little action point that like you have to do and you've got to tick it off, but here's an invitation for you. And I would like for you to seduce yourself. So whoever's listening to this today, whatever that means to you, how would you seduce yourself? Because so often when we talk about sexuality, we externalize and we kind of outsource our pleasure, and we go, oh, well, this person should provide it for me. My partner is there to provide me pleasure. And we kind of disempower ourselves when we do that. And so I want you to take some time today to seduce yourself. Now, maybe that is running your hands up along your body and just sort of giving yourself a little self-massage. Maybe it is putting a candle on and having a little like roll around boogie on the floor. Maybe it is sitting in front of a mirror and kind of seducing yourself and taking nudes, or whatever it is that makes you feel really sexy and in your body without any form of judgment, but with the focus and the goal, if you will, to be pleasure and enjoyment and presence. Be present with yourself. Really, really try to have that moment where it's like, this feels so fucking good and I'm going to just enjoy it. I'm going to relish this moment and just be with my body, whatever way that looks. That's your invitation.
I love it. And even as I was like saying the action, I was like, oh my gosh, Alicia, I think we need to come do some work again on this. But thank you, because, as I said, I think this is a really beautiful introduction to anyone who has never done any sort of focus or work in this space, who perhaps may have seen, you know, a sex educator, a sensuality coach. And even me, when I was speaking to friends, I was like, yeah, I'm working with a sensuality coach. And they're like, oh, and straight away I could tell their idea of what I was working on with my sensuality coach, what she was doing was so like, we have this idea of it. And so I really want to invite you to perhaps look into Eleanor and look at more of her work. I have worked with her. I have bought, I think, almost every one of your courses, Eleanor, because, you know, there's just so much power and beauty. I've done day workshops with Eleanor, and it's just like, I have a whole Google note. And when I left the day workshop, I had friends being like, what are the notes? Give me the notes. Tell me more. And I'm like, oh, well, listen up. Sit down, right? So look, as I said, I feel like there could be a slightly deeper conversation into some of these other areas, but I wanted this to be a really beautiful introduction, and I think it really has been. And Eleanor, I'm so grateful to you for opening up the space, for coming and speaking and holding this conversation that needed to be had.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to talk to you about all of this, and so wonderful having you as a client and seeing you thrive. It's just such a pleasure for me to witness.
So, Eleanor, for anybody who is like, give me more of this, right? Whether it's the tongue tactics, whether it is the nudes program or the art of seduction dance, no matter where they want to focus on, how can they come and find and learn more from you?
Thank you so much. So you can find me just on Instagram. It's just my name, at Eleanor Hadley. My website is the same, eleanorhadley.com, and you can find all my programs, how to work with me, everything on there. So feel free to slide into the DMs as well if you have any questions that you can't find the answers to, or if you just want to chat, then I'll be there. And I hope that this is helpful for you. And my final message would be to prioritize your pleasure. Just prioritize your pleasure. I know you prioritize so many other things in your life, but let that be one of them.